This is all very important because shortening the cycle time and basically getting to market faster is very important these days. So you don't want to wait till the provider has finished the work and then you start your work. You want to actually do it in parallel.
Can you explain what is the contract-driven development?
What we're trying to do is trying to put some kind of a structure and a process and a life cycle around this, so that this whole API life cycle can be governed and can be managed. We call this no code resiliency testing approach, because you're not really writing any code. You're basically testing against the specification and generating all of this on the fly.
If teams want to adopt this, how can they go pitch to their leadership?
We've had so many head of platforms and CTOs basically listen to us for 5 minutes, literally, right? And I'm not kidding you. And they're like sold, right? Like, this makes complete sense. Like, I don't need to, don't sell me anymore.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Lyoshin podcast. Today's guest is Naresh Jain. He's an internationally recognized technology and product development expert. For over 20 years, Naresh has been working with different companies, streamline their development processes, coaching their development teams. He's also running a consulting business called Exensio. He's built Engine, which is a conference management platform. And he's also started the Agile movement in India. Welcome, Naresh. Nice to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Web. Thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, sure. So today I invited you to talk about contract-driven development. And before we jump into the topic, would you like to share a little bit about your professional journey and the work that you're doing now?
Well, I can talk for hours about that. No problem with that. Well, I'll try and give you a quick gist. So I started my career building neural networks for the Indian Space Research Organization. That helped me get into a job with Deutsche Bank. Again, using some of the neural network work back in the late 90s, early 2000. And then I read Ken Beck's test infected paper that got me interested in looking at how, as developers, we can improve, the feedback cycles and get early feedback. From there, I discovered Martin Fowler and got to know about the company ThoughtWorks. So I joined ThoughtWorks early on. I was there for about 4 years. Then I, you know, started consulting. I helped a company in Mumbai. So I live now in India, Mumbai. And so I helped a company called DirectEye. Again, very interesting journey, because I remember the first day I was there, I was thinking to myself, like, this company is going to crash and burn because they don't understand any of the engineering practices like what I had learned 4 years at ThoughtWorks. Uh, you know, but it kind of reminded me of the manifesto, right? The people and interactions over processes and tools. And I was like, they have a bunch of really smart people. So let's see, what happens if we can get these folks and expose them to some of the interesting things. Anyway, long story short, that company did really well. They sold one of their companies for $900 million, another for $256 million. They run another unicorn right now. So it's been pretty successful, and I had a great opportunity to learn from really amazing, smart people. One of their companies now is shipping like multiple, like, I don't know, several hundred times a day to production and stuff like that. So it was just a question of exposure. uh, you know then I've done a whole bunch of consulting for different companies, including Google and Schlumberger and stuff like that, all along, basically trying to figure out, because I think one of the things I felt very early on is, some of us in the agile space tend to get too dogmatic, about things. And we live in that bubble, and we think that's basically everything. So direct eye for me was at least that wake up call where I really felt like there's a lot more than agile and stuff like that to build amazing products and change lives around us. And then I've had fortune to work with several other companies where I've had that similar experiences. And so you get to learn a lot if you believe that there is more to it than what you know. And that's probably, I think, what's kept things interesting. The last 5 years I've been advising Reliance Geo, which is the largest telecom, but they run many other businesses, including retail, healthcare, education. And again been an amazing journey to just operate at the scale they operate. It's a 6 year
Mhm.
old company valued at $88 billion.
Wow.
Heavily invested by Facebook, Meta, Google, Intel. All the big companies all around the world have invested significant amount of money. And again, when you think about it, they are not doing all the conventional things we think, quote unquote, in Agile considered as best practices. They're doing things that are quite unconventional and disrupting things very rapidly. And so that's what makes it interesting is that you may have 20 years of experience having worked with the best of the companies, but there's a lot more to learn.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things how I got to know you is somebody from previous episode mentioned that you are actually responsible for creating agile coach camps. Can you tell a little bit about that and how you came up with this idea?
All right, Agile Coach Camp. That's from a long time back now. Uh, so Deborah Hartman and I met at a conference in New York. JB Reinsberg, JB, used to run a conference in New York. So Deborah was a facilitator, and JB had invited me to come and speak at the conference. And so basically, at that point, what we had realized that a bunch of us would go to conferences and pretty much just hang out in the hallway. We wouldn't go and attend sessions because we felt like a lot of those sessions were either very beginner centric, trying to sell the agile Kool-Aid to people, and you know for some of us, we were more at the bleeding edge of things and trying to see what's not working, what can be done differently, and how we can push the boundaries further. Rather than just kind of uh, being very happy with, oh, agile is so awesome and agile does all of this stuff, right?
Mhm.
Uh, so I'd attended KitCon, which is the Continuous Integration and Testing Conference in Chicago, and they had used a unconference or an open space style format for running the conference, which meant that there were no predefined speakers. They just managed to get a really interesting bunch of folks together, and we co-created the agenda and the schedule on the fly. And I thought, so I had attended a lot of unconferences or, open spaces before, but they were generally for more non-technical conferences. So this was very interesting that you could also apply that. And then I kind of organized something called Simple Design and Testing Conference, which allowed, again, me to further take this format. But one of the interesting things of living in the US as an alien is so when I was living in the US, I was not a citizen, and I was on a H1 visa. So you have several constraints in terms of how your economical, like bank and everything else, is set up. So when I wanted to organize a conference, the first thing people said is you need like a $1 million insurance for the venue. Then you need several other clearances in terms of being able to accept funds and so forth, right, from a sponsorship point of view. So I decided to, almost accidentally, I guess, to structure Simple Design and Testing Conference as a free conference. Uh, and as a sponsorship in kind of a conference, or basically come and contribute. And the main question was, how do we ensure that we just don't get you know bombarded with 500 people at the event, because then it would just not be manageable. So one of the things we did was we came up with this idea of having a position paper. So people had to put in like a position paper, or like as a statement, what they believe in terms of maybe simple design or test driven development or any of the engineering practices. And then that would be a way of people. We actually never ended up rejecting anyone. It was just a self-selecting criteria, I guess, that allowed us to select people into this. So some of those lessons that we had learned in simple design testing conference, Deborah and I, when we organized coach camp, we tried to bring those into it. And we had John Engel, who came in and he did the facilitation of the open space itself. And we got a lot of support from fantastic folks with the first conference that we did. And I would say that it was really, really encouraging to see everyone open up. So I think the first day when we opened the conference, we basically had a kind of a lightning talks kind of a setup. So Friday evening, everyone came in. We did lightning talks. Then we went out to a bar to let people socialize. And then Saturday morning is when we did the opening of the open space, and people came and submitted topics. And I remember we had way too many topics than we could accommodate. But that was a good problem to have.
Yeah.
Uh, some very interesting topics. I remember one of them was run, coach, run, right? And this was basically, as a coach, you got to constantly put yourself in the shoes of a coachee, so that you can empathize and learn. And so, that was one of the lightning talks, and that helped like a lot of us then like relate and bumble
Yeah.
around that idea. So uh, I think people liked it, and that's one of the reasons why I believe after 15 years this kind of continues to kind of grow. And I believe we've now crossed over 100 coach camps worldwide.
Wow.
And I don't think Deb and I are anyway involved in any of these, but it's kind of autopilot. And I think Agile Alliance has also been supporting and running some of these. So it's
Yeah.
pretty interesting to see how these things have been self sufficient in some sense.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you did a lot of stuff all over the place in different countries and companies, and also agile coach camps. I attended one last fall and I really enjoyed it. I found it really uh, like very concise and very short sessions, but you learn a lot. You talk to a bunch of people at once. So yeah, that was great. I highly recommend to anybody to go. And now I think they also do it worldwide. So next one will be in, I think, Costa Rica or something like that,
Yeah.
for the first time ever. So which is also awesome. So yeah, that's great. Um, all right, let's jump into the main topic. Can you explain what is the contract-driven development?
Okay, let me maybe use an analogy to explain contract-driven development, and then maybe I'll step back and explain how what problem I was trying to solve and how I came up with this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So let's imagine that you bought a house and you want to get the interiors of the house, like the design and everything done. And so you want to hire someone to come and do the interior designing of your house. Is that common in the US? I believe so.
Yeah, if you're building a new house, I would say it's pretty common. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you might agree on a broad budget to start with, you may agree on a broad timeline, and the interior designer might get to know you and your family and can maybe get a sense of your tastes and things like that. And maybe they'll prepare some 3D models and so forth, and kind of do all of that stuff. And then you want to put all of this in some kind of a written format in terms of what's the agreement between you and the service provider. In this case, it's basically the interior designer. The cost structure, the timelines, what they will provide, what you will provide, how you want to pay out, what would be the criteria, in terms of saying something's complete, etc., etc., right? So typically you would put this in an agreement or in a contract, and then that would be the return agreement between you and the provider, right? The service provider.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically how you would manage. And if there was any confusion or misunderstanding later, then you would refer back to the contract and then, say, yes, this is what we've agreed. So the appropriate, like the right person would do their part. And this ensures that the relationship between the two continues to be healthy. It also ensures that as things evolve, because things will evolve, right? As you
Mm-hmm.
start building, it's a complex process. So as things evolve, this becomes a a place where you can go back and refer and maybe even update it as your thinking evolves, right? So this
Mm-hmm.
is very, very common in any field where two parties are coming together or multiple parties are coming together, is to basically capture their shared understanding and put it in a written contract and refer to that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is no different from what happens in software development, right? In software development, especially today with microservices, or even before this with SOA, that is service oriented architecture, what would happen is you would be providing, you would be, let's say, the developer for a particular API, and I would be consuming that API and maybe building, let's say, a UI on top of it, right? So we would sit down and we would agree in terms of what is the request I'm going to send you, what all I need to include in that, and what is the response you're going to send me back. What's going to be the schema or the data structure of the response that you're going to send me back? And if I didn't send you what I was supposed to send, then how are you going to communicate back to me in terms of, like, I messed up, right? I didn't send you the right.
Mm-hmm.
This is essentially what we try and capture in a specification, in an API specification. Okay. And there are well defined standards for these. There is open API specification, which used to be called Swagger earlier, but there is open API specification now, the new name, which is for any HTTP requests. Similarly, we have async API specifications, which is for things like asynchronous messaging for like Kafka, JMS, Google PubSub, and so forth. And if you go back in time, then we used to have SOAP, for those of you who are old enough to remember. And SOAP used to have something called WSDL, which is how they would agree on the contract, right? So contracts or API specifications are kind of pretty common in software development between providers and consumers of services. Uh, so uh, what we're trying to do is trying to put some kind of a structure and a process and a life cycle around this, so that this whole API life cycle can be governed and can be managed between them. So what we essentially recommend in contract driven development is we start with the provider and consumer coming together collaboratively, flushing out what the APIs should look like, right? And so we call that the API first approach, and we capture that in an API specification, and then we check that into a central Git repo. Because developers understand how to collaborate over a version control system like Git. So we decided that we're going to put all our specifications or contract in the central Git repo. That will be our single source of truth. All right. So you agree on the API specification, then you put it in the central contract repo. Then the provider and the consumer can start independently developing their piece of work, and both of them would refer to the API specification and do their bit. So, as a consumer of an API, I would use the API and essentially use that to generate a mock or a stub of the actual API. So I don't need the actual API. I can just work off the mock or a stub and do my development. Similarly, as a provider of a API, as a provider of a service, I would use the API as a contract test against my implementation to make sure I'm adhering to the API specification. And when each of us are done with our piece of work, we would then raise a pull request, do the same thing in the CI, make sure all of these pieces are working. And then when both of them are ready to go, then you would go to an integration environment and integrate over there. And hopefully you would not see any surprises over there, because a lot of those have been shift left and flushed out much early. And it's also through a collaborative process. Now what might also happen is, as you're developing, you may realize that, hey, I need an additional piece of information, right? Or for a new requirement, I need to tweak the existing API, or enhance the existing API. So what you would do is you would take the existing API, make the changes that you want to make, run a backward compatibility check. You want to basically make sure that the changes that you're making, you're not accidentally breaking backward compatibility. Now, in most cases, the way people test backward compatibility is they make the entire code changes, and then they take an old version of the consumer, and then they run against the like if you let's say had an app, then you would use an old version of the app with the service, and would basically make sure the app continues to work, right? So that's how a lot of people do backward compatibility. But that's too late, right? You've already made all the changes, and now it's too late to get that feedback that what you changed actually broke backward compatibility. So what we're trying to do is we are actually shifting this whole thing left, which means the moment you make the change to the API, because we're doing API design first. So the moment you make a change to the API specification, you would actually run the contract test. You would run the backward compatibility test, and you would make sure that this is backward compatible. If it's only backward compatible, then the PR, or the pull request, will be accepted, and that's when it will go into the Git repo. And then from there onwards, the provider and consumer will work off that new version, and so they wouldn't be out of sync, right? They are always now in sync, and this avoids unnecessary problems downstream. So that,
Mhm.
in a nutshell, is the idea behind contract driven development. And the problems that it's really trying to solve is the problems of finding late surprises because of contract mismatches.
Yeah.
A lot of times the collaboration is not very efficient between the provider and the consumer. Someone makes a change, they think they've communicated to another person, another team, but they have not really communicated, or people have missed it. So that communication is a bit of a challenge, so we're trying to streamline that piece. And for the provider and consumer, make it really easy from a DevX point of view, so that they can get up and running very quickly. They don't have to wait on each other. And this is also very important because shortening the cycle time and basically getting to market faster is very important these days. So you don't want to wait till the provider has finished the work and then you start your work. You want to actually do it in parallel. So that's another world challenge that we're trying to solve with this. And finally, I think on the API side, because APIs are kind of your building blocks, you want to make sure that your API itself is very resilient. So we do a whole bunch of API resiliency testing. That's all automatically generated for you, to ensure that your APIs are resilient, and all based off an API of a Open API or async API specification. So we call this the no code resiliency testing approach, because you're not really writing any code. You're basically testing against the specification and generating all of this on the fly. So that, I think, hopefully, I know I spoke a lot, but that's kind of the idea behind contract driven development and the problems it's trying to address for us.
Yeah. No, that's great, and the analogy helps. So I think I have a better understanding what this is. But then, who will be initiating to write this contract in the first place? And also, is it being written by both parties, provider and consumer?
I think that's a great question, right? So different organizations follow different approach, right? So there is a big school of thought which believes in consumer driven contract, which means the consumer who's consuming should decide what the contract should be, and they are the ones who will first write the contract, put it in the central repo, and then the provider will adhere to that, right? And I think that's a good model if that's how your organization is structured, but that might not be appropriate for every organization, because we've also seen in many organizations the provider, because there may be multiple consumers, the provider has a much deep domain understanding and would design and provide the API, saying this is the available API and this is how you're supposed to consume. Now you can build stuff on top of it, but because I have deep domain expertise and deep domain knowledge, I'm going to expose APIs in a certain fashion. So in that case, the provider is actually taking a lead, and they are the ones who are providing the specification and then putting it in the central repo. I think
Hmm.
what would be ideal, in my opinion, is it's a collaborative process where the provider and consumer come together, they flush it out, both bring a unique perspective to the table that is important, and then they do an API design first, but collaboratively, and put it. Contract driven development itself is not hung up on who does it, right? Whether the provider does it, whether consumer does it, whether both of them do it, both of them is ideal. But there are enough cases, valid cases, where
Hmm.
provider or consumer can take a lead. Should not really matter as long as that contract is put in a central Git repo and that's your single source of truth. I think rest of the process will continue seamless.
And then, which projects would be more suited for this approach? Like, for example, building a new product may be easier because you're starting from scratch. But what if you're modernizing an existing system?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. So, what kinds of projects will this be suitable for? I think to start with, any project where you have multiple things integrating with each other would be important, right? If you just had one standalone monolith, then probably this is not a problem for you to worry about, right? But most often these days, we are essentially looking at distributed systems where multiple systems are collaborating or integrating with each other. So that would be useful. That's probably where this would be most useful. Now, what kinds of projects within that, right? Is it greenfield project? Is it brownfield project? Is it legacy revival? So you may have different kinds of projects that and we can look at each of them, and each of them have, I think, a valid scenario or a use case where this might be applicable. So let's take an example of, I have a really old legacy application, and I'm basically rewriting that, modernizing it and rewriting it, right? So, first of all, in this case, I wouldn't recommend doing a big bang rewrite, right? Because I've not really seen those kinds of projects being very successful. So, you'd probably do a gradual cutover. So, if you're doing a gradual cutover, then you want to make sure that at points you have the capability of working with the old and the new both simultaneously, right? The old stack and the new tech stack. And so, in these cases, you would want to first capture what is the contract of the old system or the piece of the system that you're trying to replace, and then ensure that the new thing continues to work with that contract. And that's what ensures the ability for both old and new to work simultaneously and gradually cut over, right? So you probably use contract driven development here to establish how the old two components are integrating in the old world, and then how you can take one component, replace with the new one, but continue to maintain the contract, right? So I think if you think of those kinds of use cases, I would think it would be applicable over there. You already talked about brand new projects. If you're building brand new projects where both the provider and consumer or your several services are all kind of getting started in parallel, and you have a very short time to market, then of course this would be a sweet spot, because you could define the contract and like unleash the full potential of all your teams working in parallel and still being in conjunction with each other.
Mhm. Yeah.
Brownfield projects are interesting because you already maybe have a whole bunch of stuff working, but you're enhancing or adding something on top of it. right? Now, when you're adding or enhancing something on top of it, how do you make sure you're not breaking backward compatibility, or you're not introducing some regression as you're making those changes? So again, that's a good candidate where I would basically define the contract, ensure changes that I'm making are backward compatible and not breaking stuff that's already working. So again, that's a place where I can apply. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to highlight is that you could look at problems in the nature of your project and see where this is suitable. And I've given you three examples, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there may be many more. So I'm not advocating that contract driven development is a blanket, just close your eyes and slap it on, but look at the problem in your project, in your domain that you're trying to address. You
Mhm.
probably see that this might be a good fit to solve this particular problem, and you might want to use contract driven development in that context.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I was also thinking about the case when it may be internal to the organization, and one part of organization using the system that needs to talk to another one, and you can internally organize this between the teams. So I guess that could be also the case. Yeah.
I mean, with
So. Mhm.
AI and I think everything going on right now, I think APIs are going to become essentially, like the way different systems are going to talk to each other, and AI is going to interact with each other.
Mhm.
So if you've built like GPT plugins or things like that, you already know that GPT is very good at understanding Open API specification. In fact, you have to define your plugin as an Open API specification. You have to provide the Open API specification, and it then knows under what context to delegate things to you and so forth.
Mhm.
So I also believe that with AI, this is going to become more and more important and relevant.
So you kind of mentioned a couple of challenges there, like one being collaboration between parties and things like that. What are some of the other challenges, or maybe also cost to building it with this approach?
Yeah, so originally I was invited to help a really large organization where when they started, they were able to ship features to production every 2 weeks. And gradually, over a couple of years, they had got down to release cycles as long as 6 months. And when we analyzed the data, one of the things we saw is that a lot of their releases had slowed down because they were finding late issues during integration, and
Mhm.
that was leading to instability of the testing environment. It was also leading to, when someone's finished, they're waiting, they're like, hey, let me add this other thing while we are waiting, and then that basically leads to a bundling kind of a thing where your more and more stuff is getting accumulated,
Mhm.
to take out. So we were seeing all those antitheses, right? Like basically where integration is broken because you didn't really think about it. So now you're thinking, oh, I need to also do this other piece, and you're like, hang on, please wait, I will do this and get back. In the meantime,
Mhm.
someone deploys something else, and that breaks the environment, that makes the environment unstable. So you're like, hey, while this is unstable, let me now slap on one other thing, and so you suddenly end up with these really large bundles. You end up with a lot of regression issues and so forth, and eventually this basically delays your entire release cycles, makes them very unpredictable, and also makes the product very unstable. So if this is something that you can relate to, then this is a common anti pattern that we have seen over and over again. And so
Mhm.
the antidote for this is essentially try and decouple your releases, try and decouple your components, try and aim for independent development and deployment rather than bundling. And for all of this, you will need to ensure that the foundation by which these services are integrating is rock solid. And that's where contract driven development kind of becomes important.
Yeah, I see. And what about the cost of adopting it?
The cost of adoption with everything is twofold, right? One is, what is visible cost and what is the hidden cost. The visible cost in this case is probably very little because all the tooling and everything else is free. So there is really no, at least financially, like there is no initial
Mm-hmm.
cost that you have to pay and stuff like that. But of course, the hidden cost, which is basically the learning curve, and maybe even more importantly, not the learning curve as much as, but the changing the way people design and develop things, right? That will need to shift, because what you're trying to do is, instead of thinking of integration late in the cycle, you're thinking about that upfront. You're thinking about flushing out the contract upfront, and that's not an easy skill for a lot of people, right? They'd rather just hack some code and then figure out how to make those jigsaw puzzles fit together. uh,
Mm-hmm.
that's fine in some cases, but in large enterprise products where time to market is really critical, you can't just take the chance of just hacking something and then hoping that they'll all fit together, right? So you
Yeah.
really need to shift this left and get people to think about API design first, and try to make a lot of implicit, design decisions explicit. And
Mm-hmm.
it kind of has a very similar effect as test driven development, if you will. Because in test driven development, you are, just writing the test first, but that really changes a lot in terms of how you're designing, how you're thinking about it, what principles are at play, what's your style of design, more like a reflexive design rather than like a big upfront, ivory tower architect type design. So some of those same principles are at play here as you're flipping things around. You're getting people to think about this upfront, and you're trying to do this in a very iterative, feedback driven manner. uh, and so, those are all the hidden costs, if you will, that one will have to
Mm-hmm.
take into account. And I think at the end of the day, it's a big cultural shift in many organizations, in terms of the provider and consumer collaborating and working together. That's often, in many organizations, some ivory tower person is going to just write some blurb and say, here's how these things will talk.
Mm-hmm.
And that really doesn't have much meaning to it. Only when the teams sit down and start integrating, that's when they come up with all challenges, and like, what's the data type, what should happen in this case, what should happen in this scenario. So we're trying to preempt all of those things, so that you can avoid those last minute surprises.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot of, not a lot of, but some knowledge required to be at the product management level for people who are driving the teams and making those connections and setting up like the sessions for developers to figure out or engineers to figure out. Yeah. So you mentioned a little bit about how what the advantages of contract-driven development, like resilience there, backward compatibility is there. Are there any other advantages that you can mention in terms of like scalability or product quality and things like that?
Sure. So I think the big advantage that I touched upon so far is the shift left and getting early feedback, right? Which is very important from a developer experience point of view. Second is basically because of parallel development, you are able to basically shorten your release cycles, because things can happen in parallel. They're not waiting on each other. You can independently deploy and things like that. The third is improvement in terms of the collaboration between the teams and avoiding those last minute surprises. So better collaboration, and
Mm-hmm.
collaboration not in the sense of, let's all meet together and have a nice party. It's collaboration in the sense of, here's how I'm going to check in code, here's how I'm going to notify you, here's the pull request, here's the process, this is what we will follow. Everything's documented, everything's visible. There would be no surprises. That kind of actual hands-on day-to-day collaboration, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the fourth benefit, which you briefly touched upon, is because of resiliency testing and early API testing, you are ending up to you're basically result. It would result in your APIs being a lot more resilient, well tested, and that of course will ensure that your APIs itself are not going to fall over, and in production you will not have outages and stuff like that. Uh, does this lead to better scalable design? Uh, I'm not sure if this would directly result in scalability because I think there is some more additional thought process that is required to make sure your APIs are designed from a scalability point of view. Your business processes are aligned towards them being scalable. So, for example, would contract driven development force you to be async versus sync? Probably nothing in contract driven development per se will force you to use async or sync, right? But that's a different thought process you might bring to table, saying, hey, I want to make sure that I can handle extremely large volumes of load, and even when my I have sudden bursts of requests coming in, I want the ability to be able to still keep accepting requests. And so that's when I would probably go and design something to be asynchronous. And so those are the slightly different thought process that contract driven development itself may not bring to the table. So
Mm-hmm.
scalability, I would say, requires this plus more stuff.
Okay. And then you mentioned that tooling is kind of, well, most of tooling for free, and people already kind of know this. Can you mention which ones, if the team is now want to start using this, where they can start with this?
Yeah, so I would recommend there's not a lot written about it. It's still kind of relatively new, and even though contract driven development as a terminology is pretty old, I don't think some of this thinking is that widely adopted and used. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so there isn't like a lot on this subject. Long back, I'd written an article on InfoQ, but recently I did a talk at Yao conference in Australia. I think that might be a good starting point where I demonstrate the open source tool called Specmatic that we've built to do contract driven development, and I kind of did a live demo showing how it's able to do. Ensure first of all that your API specification and implementation is in sync. Then it's able to take a dependent service that you have and basically use a proxy to stub it out by generating a contract for you. Also things like Kafka or other kinds of things, how you can stub that out. So it kind of gives you a step-by-step walkthrough of that. So that
Mm-hmm.
would be a good place to kind of get understanding of some of these concepts. Uh, and then I think there are a bunch of tools we have done. Some, if you go to the specmatic.io website, you might also see some comparisons we have done with other tools. And so you might be able to kind of use that as a reference. And, again, it's just a good starting point for you to look at other alternatives and compare and contrast. We obviously have our viewpoint, but, we would welcome you to kind of go and test it out yourself.
Yeah. So is that the tool that you built with your company?
Yeah, so Specmatic is something that Joel, me, and Hari, three of us originally built it out. We put it open source. It's still open source. In the past, I've had some bad experience open sourcing, and then a big company coming and chasing me with a patent stick. So this time, what we try to do is to just protect our own interest. We put most of the stuff out in the open source, and then when we wanted to patent it, we were told that at least in India, you can't patent if it's all publicly available already, because it's public news at public knowledge at that point. So we kept parts of it private. And basically that's what the patents have been. We've now started getting the grants. We've got a few patents granted already and a few more in the process. So hopefully we will be able to, at least the original thought process, will open source all of this stuff and give it for free once we have the patents. But something along the way happened, and that was very interesting for me. uh, so when we had this open source, we would get emails from people, like, I'm not kidding you, but at least 5 emails every day asking, what is the future plan for this? How does this project line up on your roadmap? What is your business model? How are you going to make money out of it? I've evaluated it, I really like it, but I am worried to recommend it because I'm not sure you people from India, when you will disappear. so
Mhm.
uh, so we would get a lot of these emails, and we would keep wondering, like, what do we do, right? Like, uh, and then of course, you know one of our very good friend, very big, very popular person in the industry, he called up one day and said, are you stupid? Like, why are you throwing away $1 billion company? Why don't you monetize this? And we were like, no, I mean, this is really not the intent behind it. We just wanted to open source this, and we believe a lot more people would benefit from it. He's like, yes, but when you give it away for free, people actually don't really value it.
Mhm.
And that kind of resonated with what was happening with all those emails. So, just as a thought experiment, we essentially put a pricing page and we said, here's our pricing plan. And what we saw is that the downloads had skyrocketed. The moment we put a pricing page, the number of downloads had significantly gone up, almost a hockey stick growth, right? And so now what we are thinking is, what is open source will continue to be open source, and we are continuing to add new stuff. But there are few niche things that we've done which are more enterprise features. We'll probably monetize those as a commercial product and essentially offer that as an enterprise license. And we've already signed a few deals from an enterprise license. So that also gives us the confidence that yes, people are actually willing to pay money,
Mhm.
even though most of the stuff is available for free. Because one of our big customers basically said, you know what, if I don't pay you guys and you disappear, I'll be in trouble. So I'd rather pay you. So that was very nice of him. And so we've now had a few customers who are supporting us through the commercial thing so that we can continue to keep most of this stuff open source.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. And that's actually a great test when you put a pricing page, people start signing up. That's trust, right? They believe you'll be there for a while. So
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to charge, then you better be professional about it. And so I can expect professional service from you guys. And so that makes sense. I mean, in hindsight, it makes sense that, when
yeah.
you have a pricing page, more people download stuff. But before that, we were like surprised. It's like, hey, I'm giving you this whole thing is out there, and if we disappear tomorrow, you can always take the source code and do what you want to do, right? It's not a hosted service that's only with us, and if we disappear, then you're left with nothing. Uh, but yeah, I think sometimes that's not how other people
Yeah, that's how market works, right? So,
work.
yeah. So if again, if teams want to adopt this, how can they go pitch to their leadership and say, "Hey, we found this great approach. We want to try this. We think it's great." Are there any tactics for them?
This is a very common question, and also something that always surprises me, right? Like, we've had so many head of platforms and CTOs basically listen to us for 5 minutes, literally, right? And I'm not kidding you. And they're like sold, right? Like, this makes complete sense. Like, I don't sell me anymore. In fact, one of them told us that cut out all your slides. We don't need to see any of your slides. Just show me the last slide and that's it. Like, just one slide and that's it, right? and uh, so my point is that I think technical leaders and leaders in general, you don't need to really sell this idea. They get it. All right. So, to your question, what do I need to go to sell to my leadership? Really, not much. One slide, literally, right?
Yeah.
But I think before you do that, right, if I was in your place, what I would do is I would try it out myself and get comfortable with it. I would
Mm.
not take someone's word for it, right? I would actually try it out, because sometimes ideas sound great on a PPT. Ideas sound great when someone tells us about it, right? But when we actually try it, there's a lot of impedance mismatch between what you heard and what you actually experience. So my recommendation is, before you go and pitch to anybody or try and convince anybody else, first be convinced, first experience it yourself, right? So for example, Specmatic is open source. You can just go get download the thing. We have a lot of sample projects. You can take one of the sample project and just give it a spin first, right? Then maybe if you're developing an API, take it and run it against your API and see what it shows up, right? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? uh, you know
Hmm.
and this is generally like what I've been advising people. And I've heard very really interesting and inspiring stories, right? The other day someone got back saying, I tried it on my service, and this generated 9,000 some tests for me, right? And at first I thought this was a bug in the software. Why was it generating 9,000 tests for an API? But when I looked at what it was doing, it was very interesting. It was trying to generate all possible combinations that and I found some 800 some tests did not pass, right? And again, when I dug into it, it made me realize that there were corner cases that I'd never thought about, or I would have not imagined that it is possible, or I'd not safeguarded myself, or in some cases I thought the framework will take care of it, but it was not. It was doing something else, etc. So when people have that kind of an experience, that's when I know that they've really tried it. They now know how it works. Now is a good time to go and pitch to someone else, right? So that's my general advice, is like, a, give it a spin yourself. Don't be too worried about convincing leadership, because that's actually very easy. So first,
Hmm.
give it a spin yourself. You be convinced that this makes sense, then maybe spread the word, and then I'm sure leadership will see value in it, and it'll resonate with them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is awesome. If the tool can do this, then that's really just one slide presentation showing them like, hey, this is what we've got. You don't need QA engineers. You don't need like people manually testing. I remember in the old days, I used to help with testing, and it was like literally manually clicking buttons, trying to cover all the possible cases, writing down all the issues. It's enormous amount of time. And if you can do it in like a few minutes, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great.
In fact, I would like to quote Jez Humble. So I met Jez recently. I used to work with Jez at ThoughtWorks. Jez Humble is the guy who co-authored the Continuous Delivery book and has done a bunch of really amazing work after that. So Jez saw the demo of Specmatic, and he basically was summarizing that all great ideas in hindsight look common sense. Uh, and that's why basically one slide is good enough to explain what it is, because it is common sense. But it's not
Hmm.
common sense until someone's actually gone that extra mile and proved that that's how it is. But once someone's done that, then it's like, yeah, obvious, right? Like, how else would you do it?
Yeah.
And I thought that was very profound, the way Jay Humble had put it, right? Like, all great ideas in hindsight look common sense. And if you think about it, like, Agile feels exactly that way, right? It's like common sense, but no one was doing it things that way until someone actually, or some people actually showed it and proved it that this actually makes sense. Then everyone is like, yeah, this is just common sense. So I hope, and I believe what Jess says is true. I hope more people will look at it and will have the same expression that, yeah, just one slide is enough. and it's common sense, right? Like so, that's
Yeah,
time will tell us, but that's what I think.
yeah, the product speaks for itself, right? So yeah, that's great. All right. So we're coming to an end here. Would you like to say anything else to the community, to people who would like to start using the technology, or anything that we haven't covered yet?
Well, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening these days. So I'm not sure I'll be able to. I'm not sure what I have covered and what I have not covered. There's a lot in that. So of course, go check it out and give it a spin for yourself. That'll be a good starting point for you. But also, I think just in general, my experience is don't get too dogmatic with anything. Right, like just
Mm-hmm.
be pragmatic, try things, see if it works, then take it. If it doesn't, move on. Right, life is too short to be dogmatic and be hung up with stuff that doesn't actually work. So
Yeah.
that's what I would suggest as parting thoughts here.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Many people just stick with something and blindly keep doing this, even if it doesn't work for them. So, but yeah, that's great advice. Okay, Naresh, thank you very much for your time today. That was great conversation, a great new technology for somebody to learn about, and I hope we can talk more in the future.
Cool. I enjoyed it. Thanks, Vit, for hosting this. And I must say, you had some really amazing questions. Got me to think. So, yeah, thanks for that. And do check out specmatic.io for more details.
Yep, yep, sounds good. Great. All right. Have a good one. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.